An Ontario teacher writes a powerful column saying that we have betrayed our children, and sadly, it has fallen on deaf ears. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for tuning in to The Candice Malcolm Show today. Now, I'm going to talk about this really powerful Substack that came out over the weekend, late last week actually. But before we do, just give you a quick update. The big story in the country continues to be the huge trucker convoy heading to Ottawa and the courageous blue-collar warriors who are fighting back and standing up for all of our freedoms. God bless them. We continue to see the legacy media picking up the most negative aspects of the story, trying to paint these people as fringe, trying to say that they're some kind of extremists, sort of painting the picture like it could be some kind of a January 6th event or preparing for something like that, or we see them focusing again on the negative, like the issues around the GoFundMe page. Regardless, these courageous truckers are persevering, and I'll just say the footage is inspiring. It is great to see so many people in this country fighting back, and let me just say the estimates of this event are huge. I've heard upwards of 500,000 people are planning to attend this rally, perhaps up to 50,000 truckers heading to Ottawa. So that might be an overshoot, but still those numbers are profound. Like, we're talking about some of the biggest rallies in the history of our country. And to me, for someone who has been sort of suffering through the pandemic and feeling at so many times like our country has walked away from our charter, we've turned our back on our ancient freedoms. We've been so willing to sacrifice them in exchange for safety, in exchange for so-called health, public health. That has made me feel distraught at times. But seeing all of these people is truly inspiring, and I hope it inspires you as well. So here's just some video footage from the past 24 hours. And that comes from our friend Andy Lee, who is an independent journalist and reporter who has the Twitter handle Hannah Bananas. And another clip here from Mary Oakes, a tremendous independent journalist who has been providing great footage. So here is a video that she recorded. And interestingly, more and more conservative MPs are throwing their support behind these truckers and showing critical signs of the vaccine mandates, of the failed policy of vaccine mandates. Of course, very interesting, despite the waffling of their party leader. We have a group of MPs who are just flat out saying that they support the truckers. So here is high-profile MP Pierre Poilievre saying this, pretty funny. The unmasked partier is worried the guy alone in his truck is spreading COVID, #justinflation. And of course, we know Justin Trudeau is a massive hypocrite. The rules don't apply to him, and he is punishing blue-collar workers. Leslyn Lewis, who is a former leadership candidate for the Conservatives, wrote this. She says, "I'm proud of the truckers. Peaceful protest is a cornerstone of our democracy. The Liberal mandates are unscientific, vindictive, mean-spirited, and promote segregation. The people have a moral obligation to oppose unjust laws and mandates." And she quote tweeted former leader Andrew Scheer, who I read this tweet on the program yesterday, but he writes this: "Thank you, truckers. Trudeau is attacking personal liberty and threatening everyone's ability to get groceries because of his overreach on vaccine mandates. He is the biggest threat to freedom in Canada." Absolutely agree with that. Many more Conservative MPs are likewise joining in to throw their support behind this movement. Martin Shields writes this. He says, "I am in Ottawa awaiting the trucking convoy on its way to the capital. Canadian supply chains are critical, and the Trudeau Liberal government's mandates and freedom-curbing restrictions have gone on too long. It's time to get our freedoms back." Likewise, we have Kevin Way, who says this: "I supported our local truck drivers as they hit the road in Saskatoon today. It should have never come to this for them. Safe travels, and I will see you folks in Ottawa." Shannon Stubbs: "Great big thanks to the organizers and to everyone taking part. Let's make sure we do whatever we can to show our support to the Convoy for Freedom 2022. Really just lots of support. Jeremy Patzer: "Huge crowds in Swift Current for the convoy to Ottawa," and he's got some video footage there. Ryan Williams students support the truckers. We need them more than ever. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There are a lot of MPs throwing their support behind the trucking convoy, which is great to see. And I hope that Aaron O'Toole, the leader of the party, comes around and follows the rest of his party by supporting this convoy and supporting freedom in this country. Okay, I want to talk about this incredible column that was published last Thursday on Barry Weiss's Substack. It was published late last week, written by a woman named Stacey Lance, who describes herself as a proud mother and educator living in Ontario, Canada. It's interesting because I listen to a lot of podcasts and I sometimes get news from the US, and I've been hearing about this Substack, this article on Barry Weiss's Substack, through a lot of people in the US. And when I finally went to click on it and read it, I realized that it was a Canadian teacher, a Canadian telling her story about the Canadian experience. And to me, that shows two things. One, the fact that Americans are talking about the Canadian experience more than I hear Canadians talking about it is really disappointing. And second, the fact that this op-ed, which is a beautiful, well-written piece, I'm going to read much of it today, the fact that rather than publishing this in a Canadian publication, she didn't publish in the National Post. She didn't go to the Globe and Mail. She didn't go to the Toronto Star. Instead, she went to Barry Weiss. Barry Weiss used to work for the New York Times, and then she sort of left out of protest because of how maddeningly woke that publication has become. And her Substack is very popular now. It's become sort of like an editorial page for the disaffected, usually like left-wing or center-left or liberal crowd in the US, and really attracting a lot of interesting people. But just the very fact that she submitted her op-ed here. Now, I haven't had the chance to speak to her. We've reached out and waiting to hear back. But I wonder, I mean, it's curious as to why she would go to a U.S. publication rather than going in Canada. And to me, it just shows that perhaps there's just no interest in Canada. There's no appetite for this. I don't know if she tried to submit it to other places and got rejected, or if she just went straight to Barry Weiss because perhaps that's where she gets her news. But either way, it's telling that the independent voices on the internet, the independent journalists, the independent platforms is what is attracting most of the most interesting journalism in the country. Okay, so a bit more about Stacey Lance. She is based in Ottawa. She works as a teacher at the Catholic school. She's worked in this Canadian public school system for the past 15 years. She teaches high school, and she teaches morals and ethics in high school. So she is perfectly qualified to be talking about these issues. And the piece that she writes here is called, "I'm a school teacher. The kids aren't all right." Really, really powerful stuff. And so here we go. Let me just jump right into it. So again, the title is, "I'm a public school teacher. The kids aren't all right." The subtitle here says, "My students were taught to think of themselves as vectors of disease. This has fundamentally altered their understanding of themselves." So here she goes. "I am proud to be a teacher. I've worked in the Canadian public school system for the past 15 years, mostly at the high school level, teaching morals and ethics. I don't claim to be a doctor or an expert in virology. There is a lot I don't know, but I spend my days with our youth, and they tell me a lot about their lives. And I want to tell you what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing. Since the beginning of the pandemic, when our school went fully remote, it was evident to me that the loss of human connection would be detrimental to our students' development. It also became increasingly clear that the response to the pandemic would have immense consequences for students who are already on the path to long-term disengagement, potentially altering their lives permanently. The data about learning loss and mental health crisis is devastating. Overlooked has been the deep shame young people feel. Our students are taught to think of their schools as hubs for infection and themselves as vectors of the disease. This has fundamentally altered their understanding of themselves." This stuff is so obvious and so true, and yet we rarely hear this point. We rarely hear this perspective. We rarely hear someone so reasonably discussing the pros and cons of our approach and some of the sort of deeper consequences of these continued lockdowns of telling kids that they have to follow all of these really obscure rules and just the psychological effect of it all. And again, it's really refreshing to hear this. I will continue from this Substack. She writes, "When we finally got back into the classroom in September 2020, I was optimistic, even when we would go remote for weeks, sometimes months, whenever cases would rise, but things never returned to normal. When we were physically in school, it felt like there was no longer life in the building. Maybe it was the masks that made it so that no one wanted to engage in lessons or even talk about how they spent their weekends. It felt cold and soulless. My students weren't allowed to gather in the halls or chat between classes. They still aren't. Sporting events, clubs, and graduation were all canceled. This may sound like small things, but these losses were a huge deal to students. These are rites of passages that cannot be made up. In my classroom, the learning loss is noticeable. My students can't concentrate and they aren't doing the work that I assigned to them. They have way less motivation mentioned, compared to before the pandemic began, some of my students chose not to come back at all, either because of fear of the virus or because they are debilitated by social anxiety. And now they have the option to do virtual schooling from home. Again, these are so many points that just need to be made. They need to be discussed. They need to be part of the public discussion. They're so relevant. We are living in a time of immense change, immense progress. And with that progress, the lives of teenagers today are very different from the lives of teenagers 10 years ago, which are very different from the lives of teenagers 10 years before that. There's just constant change. Everything is new. The introduction of technology, the constant use of social media, the amount of time that children spend on screens and sort of as avatars of themselves is already having a really damaging effect. I mean, read Coddling of the American Mind to sort of understand how the idea of safetyism and protecting children has superseded other things. And because of that, they're not developing in the same rate as previous generations. And then you add on top of that, which was already happening, the trends that they were picking up on in that book, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Luganoff, that book was focused on like the 2012 to 2015. I think the book came out around then, 2015, 2016. Obviously, that's all pre-COVID. And you compound that with the impact of forcing kids to stay at home and making everything virtual and isolated. And even when they're back in school, they can't talk, they can't do normal things. It really, again, profound impact. And we don't really seem to ever be talking about this. Okay, I'm going to continue reading from this Substack because, again, I think it is so excellent. So she writes, my older students, grade 11 and 12, aren't allowed a lunch break and are expected to come to school, go to class for 5.5 hours, and then go home. Children in 9th and 10th grade have to face the front of the classroom when they eat lunch during a second period class. My students used to be able to eat in the halls of the cafeteria. Now that's forbidden. Younger children are expected to follow the mask off, voices off rule and are made to wear their masks even outside. This is so absurd, where they can only play with kids in their class. Of course, outside of school, kids are allowed to go to restaurants with their families and to each other's houses, making the rules feel punitive and nonsensical. That's how we all feel. But again, for children, it's hard to even make sense of why adults are telling you to follow rules that are inconsistent and don't make sense. I'll continue reading. They are anxious and depressed. Previously outgoing students are now terrified at the prospect of being singled out to stand in front of the class and speak. Many of my students seem to have found comfort behind their masks. They feel exposed when their peers can see their whole face. Around this time of year, we start planning for prom, which is usually held in June. Usually my students would already be chatting constantly about who's asking who, what they're planning on wearing, and how excited they are. This year, they barely discussed it at all. When they do tell me about it, they say that they don't want to get their hopes up since they're assuming it will get canceled like it has for the past couple of years. It's the same deal with universities. My students say, if university is going to be like this, then what's the point? I have my own children, a 9-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son, who have spent almost a third of their lives in lockdown. They've become so used to cancellations that they don't even feel disappointed anymore. I think all of my students are angry to some degree, but I hear about it most from the kids who are athletes. They are told that if they got the vaccine, everything would go back to normal, and they would go back to the rink or the court. Some sports were back for a while, but as of Christmas, because of the recent wave of COVID-19 cases, clubs and varsity sports are all canceled once again. A lot of the athletes are missing chances to be seen by coaches and get scholarships. Again, it's hard to even wrap your head around how devastating this could be for a child. You get one shot. You get one shot to make it, to get a scholarship, to go to college, to try to play in some kind of elite level of your sport. And it's being passed by for these children. They're following the rules. They got vaccinated. They did what they were told, and yet they still rip it away. And you think about how frustrating that is for you and I. Well, we're adults. We can understand. We can contemplate the fact that the world is full of disappointments and that governments are often corrupt and that the power corrupts them indefinitely. But these are kids. These are idealistic young people. The way that we are treating them is absolutely unconscionable. Okay, I'm going to read the last little excerpt here. She writes, what's most worrisome to me is that they feel deep worry and shame over the prospect of breaking the rules. Teenage girls are notoriously empathetic. I see many of my students, but especially the female ones, feel a heavy burden of responsibility. Right before Christmas, one of my brightest 12th graders confided in me that she was terrified of taking her mask off. She told me she didn't want to get anyone sick or kill anyone. She was worried she would be held responsible for someone dying. What was I supposed to say? That only 23 children have died from COVID in Canada during the whole pandemic, and that she is much more likely to kill someone driving a car? The kids in Scandinavia, Sweden, and the Netherlands largely haven't had to wear masks, and their schools haven't seen outbreaks because of it. That masks are not a magical shield against the virus, and that even if she were to pass it along to a classmate, the risk of them getting seriously sick is minuscule. I want to tell them they can remove their masks and socialize with their friends without being worried, but I am expected to enforce the rules. At the beginning of the pandemic, adults shamed kids for wanting to play in the park or hang out with their friends. We kept hearing, oh, they'll be fine, they're resilient. It's true, humans by nature are very resilient, but they also break, and my students are breaking. Some have already broken. When we look at the COVID-19 pandemic through the lens of history, I believe it will be clear that we betrayed our children. The risks of this pandemic were never to them, but they were forced to carry the burden of it. It's enough. It's time to return to a normal life and put an end to the bureaucratic policies that aren't making society any safer, but are sacrificing our children's mental, emotional, and physical health. Our children need life on the highest volume, and they need it now. This is the most important op-ed I have read in months in Canada. I hope that every Canadian will read it. I hope it will have an impact. Again, unfortunate that she had to go to a US Substack in order to publish it. However, obviously Barry Weiss's Substack has great reach, and I'm glad that it did, and I'm glad that I came across it because, again, really powerful. Bravo to Stacey Lance, the courageous, brave teacher who published this piece, who had the courage to articulate her views, what she sees with working with students, and put it out there. We know that there could be backlash, there could be consequences for articulating this point of view, which is contrary to, I'm sure, what the teachers' unions and the politicians and the health experts want to hear, but it is so important. And again, I hope every Canadian will read this. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.